For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Shannon. I'm at Deloitte Consulting in Woodmead, Johannesburg, to find out more about Africa's rising middle class. The rise of the middle class as a percentage of the population has been steady. Can you tell us firstly what defines the middle class in Africa, and secondly about the numbers and the projected growth of this middle class in the coming years?
Perhaps just to give you some context to what's been happening on the continent, Africa is currently the region that boasts the highest number of high-growth economies in the world. So currently now and into the foreseeable future, 7 of the fastest 10 growing economies are African: the DRC, Angola, Mozambique, Tanzania, Ghana, Nigeria. So as African economies grow, this growth, we see that it's trickling down, so that consumers have got higher per capita spending, so GDP per capita is growing. So for example, if you look in 1980, Africa had about 100 million middle class people. This grew to about 313 million in 2010 and is projected to reach 1.1 billion by 2060. And as these economies grow, this growth is trickling down towards the populations. So suddenly people have got more spending power, there's more GDP per capita. Just to illustrate the growth that has taken place, for example, in 1980, there was 111 million Africans classified as middle class. This grew to 313 million in 2010 and is projected to reach 1.1 billion by 2060. So clearly Africa presents a compelling investment case, just given that there's a captive market that is likely to grow over the next few decades.
You state that Africa's population boom captures both an opportunity and a dilemma. Can you elaborate on the challenges as well as the opportunity this boom represents?
It's just like most things in life. There's good and bad. Okay. So if you look at it, in order to really grow economies, you need investment. In order to have investment, you need an educated population, and you also need a consumer population who are going to acquire goods. Okay, so Africa's growing population means that in time you're going to have numbers that is going to be able to acquire these goods, and therefore consumers and manufacturers will be attracted to the market. However, at the same time, in order to get to that middle class that we're talking about, this rise and rise of the African middle class, you need skilled labor force. And that is where the challenge lies. The challenge lies in educating a labor force that can meet the requirements of the demanding world. We at Deloitte believe that this is not only the responsibility of governments, but also the responsibility of civil society. One of the things that we've initiated in this regard in the Southern African market is the Deloitte Graduate Academy, which helps to teach graduates relevant work skills to make them more marketable in the workplace.
Who is classified as middle class in Africa? Where do they live and what type of work do they do?
From a statistical perspective, the middle class is defined as those earning between $2 and $20 a day, rather spending between $2 and $20 a day. So there's what's called the upper middle class, they earn between 10 and 20. The lower middle class spend between $4 and $10, and then the floating class earn between $2 and $4 a day. So the floating class is not considered a very stable subsector, simply because they can easily just fall back into poverty depending on the global dynamics and what's happening to the various economies.
To add to that, who are we looking at? So we're looking at people who typically live in urban areas, typically have tertiary levels of education, are focused on their children, on their children's health and welfare. Typically they have less children than other generations. But one of the most interesting things about the African middle class is that they're not necessarily in formal employment. And entrepreneurship and generation of income through your own businesses is an increasing characteristic of the African middle class. But on the other hand, just like middle class throughout the world, they are also the consumers of household durable goods. They want the flat screen TVs, the latest tech, and those are the things that you will see coming through. What we find typically though is that they are not at all typically from rural areas or involved in farming activities.
I think the other thing is to just qualify why spending $2 a day is classified as middle income. I think Africa still is, despite how fast it's growing, it still remains the world's poorest continent. So this spending has to be taken within that context. So the spending of $2 to $20 a day being classified as middle class is in the context of Africa being the poorest continent, but it's also in relation to the average income on the continent.
What opportunities are presented by the growth of Africa's middle class?
I think there's a huge opportunity that a lot of banks and financial institutions are perhaps missing. I think there's opportunity for formalizing informal saving schemes. So like the Stokvels in South Africa, for example, I think banks could capitalize on those. So to ensure that people put money in the bank rather than lend amongst themselves at a decent interest rate. I think there's also a huge opportunity for funding women entrepreneurs. So as we know, African women are particularly resilient. They're the backbone of a lot of African societies. It's very interesting to see how a lot of African families have been raised by moms working at the market selling vegetables, and she raises 6 kids on that. You know, that's quite extraordinary. So banks just need to tap into that market that exists but is currently underserved, and they need to see it not as a charity case, but there's actually a strong business case for it. I think the World Bank estimates that there's a $20 billion opportunity in that. So you find a lot of African women who are entrepreneurs, not out of choice, because of various societal factors, lack of education, you know, they don't have the collateral to borrow against, you know, but banks need to look at that market differently.
The things that I would add on the financial services side would be, particularly in the insurance industry, you'll find that the insurance industry across the continent is not particularly well developed, and there's definitely opportunity for relevant insurance products across the board. And as Jackie was saying, you know, it's not only in South Africa that you have things like in Stokvels, you have investment clubs all across the continent. And so there is a culture of saving, but the culture of saving is in a very informal manner and could be formalized. But what's most interesting for businesses looking into the continent from a consumer perspective is actually the intersection of financial services and technology. That's where you really see the differences coming out, and where the opportunities like M-Pesa and more like that, I think, is really where the big spin will be. On the other hand, for banks, you know, you talk about the consumer, but in order to have the consumer is attracted by shops, they're attracted by shopping malls, which I'm sure Jackie will tell you a bit more of. But there's also the opportunity to finance all of these projects across the continent.
And when we speak to a lot of our clients who are moving onto the continent, they all complain about a lack of a formal retail infrastructure. So typically in countries, people go to open air markets. So they go in with the South African mentality of having a retail mall where you take space, but that doesn't exist. But I think investors need to look at this differently. So rather than seeing that as an obstacle, they need to see it as the investment opportunity. So therefore, the opportunity for shopping malls, mixed development is particularly big right now. But also, just going back to the financing issue, mortgages, for example, a lot of the continent, people operate on a cash basis. So in certain countries, if you want a car, you pay for it cash. So there's huge opportunity for vehicle financing and for mortgages, for people can purchase assets.
That was Dr. Jacqueline Chimhanzi and Anushuya Gounden discussing the rise of Africa's middle class.